Good afternoon. The only thing better than Between Two Ferns may be a fireside chat. So up next, we have a fireside chat with Daniel Suarez, New York Times bestselling author of Daemon Critical Mass. And please join me in welcoming our speakers, Tish Shute, co-founder of AWE and former Director of Technology Strategy and Planning at FutureWay Technologies, and Daniel Suarez, New York Times bestselling author. Thank you.
It's really great pleasure, Daniel, to welcome you to AWE 2023. And I think it would be really great today if you could set the stage a bit and talk about some of your work and how that, your interest in space exploration and what you've been doing in your latest novels to blueprint our future.
Okay. It is true that I'm a science fiction author, but all 7 of my books have been set in either the present day or the very near future. So I don't write about the far distant future. And they're all based upon a great deal of current research. And that's probably why so many venture capitalists and technology people and defense people read my books. So the good thing about that is I've just spent the last several years researching a trilogy about space. And I'm on the 3rd book of that trilogy, the Delta V trilogy, which is Delta V and Critical Mass so far. And the good news about that is I'm coming here to talk about a lot of the findings I have about the use for augmented reality and virtual reality in space and how it actually is going to be critical in becoming a celestial civilization and building out off-world industry. Now again, I say that, sure, as a science fiction novelist, but also in a very real way, as I'll talk about.
Yes, and I think one thing it's important, if you're not familiar with Daniel's oeuvre and body of work, how much, he's written about so much technology over the years, but with an extraordinary ability to predict what is going to happen with technology in the future.
It's as alarming to me
it is a little alarming. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think, the latest 2 novels that you just mentioned, Delta V and Critical Mass, part of this trilogy, they focus on this new age of space exploration. Yes. And you also talk about how this, in real life, we're going to see this huge expansion in the next couple of decades. And I mean, what's really, it's just amazing for a person like me who's been in the industry so long to read the precision you place AR, VR technology in this effort in space. And I would love you to talk a little bit more about that and some specifics, because it's really extraordinary and coupled with your ability to predict, I think this audience will be rather interested.
Well, the good news about that is that this is not a cautionary tale. A lot of my books in the past have been cautionary tales. This is actually inspirational, and it is as much inspirational for me as it is for the readers who get in touch with me. What I set about to do with this series of books is something that's always fascinated me is we imagine cool sci-fi things in the future, and I really wanted to understand how step by step do we really get there, because we're at the point where we are sending things into space regularly. Space travel is going to become more and more of a commonplace thing. How do we actually cross that gulf without any hand-waving? So I went for years and I interviewed scientists and government officials and astropreneurs and billionaires to try to assemble a narrative that was realistic, that was, again, no hand-waving. And it changed me in the process, because I was initially a person who thought, well, Mars is going to figure prominently in the near term. And as I started to research this, I realized that cislunar space, which is the neighborhood of space around the Earth and the Moon, a little past the Moon, is going to be very important for us, not just to go out into space, but to help preserve the biosphere of Earth. Basically, in order to preserve our planet, we need to go out into deep space, start to gather resources and energy. And it's a rather urgent thing. And the other thing is that's how we can grow the economy. There's 3 or 4 billion people who exist at a subsistence level right now, and this will allow us to avail ourselves of a lot of resources, a lot of energy, and to further expand everything in our civilization. And again, as I'll explain in a moment, augmented reality and VR are going to be absolutely critical. So if you never thought that you could go through an astronaut program, but you love space and want to work in space, these skills that you have, I think, are going to be critical. And I made a point of coming here to say that because I don't think many people fully appreciate it.
Yes, and I mean, I think one of the things that, because you have made this like a blueprint for how this might occur, and I was very struck in critical mass that really AR, VR actually make possible this work to, basically build a spaceship in space.
I should probably recap it because I'm sure not everybody in the audience has read these books. What it starts out as a story of an unsanctioned near-Earth asteroid mining mission. I wanted to postulate what is actually possible, and there's a lot of people in the world who go on, adventures. They climb Mount Everest. I spent a good deal of time with cave divers. And when you hang out with some of these people, you start to think these people are more courageous and more risk-taking than astronauts could ever be. Because, of course, NASA is going to have a lot of controls. And a lot of these people were just like base jumpers. The people who fly the wingsuits, they wear like a flying squirrel outfit and they fly between trees. This is the type of person who's going to go out and push the envelope. And I really wanted to capture that culture and say, what if you took 8 people like that and a billionaire who has kind of some edgy ideas, what could you actually accomplish in space? And so I chose a near-Earth asteroid, Ryugu, and I carefully chose that. I chose a particular real-world trajectory. In 2032, you could get to this asteroid with less energy than it would take to reach the moon. And we go off from there. And you gathering all of the mass from that asteroid, you bring it into a lunar orbit, you start to have thousands of tons of resources in free space that we can start to build, a beachhead, if you will, in space. And once you've done that, things start to accelerate. Now, the reason why telepresence in particular and AR are so useful, I'll start with telepresence. We always see in films that people get on the spacesuit and they go out and they start doing things in space. And I do not think it's fully appreciated that 19 hours in space, you will get a year's dose of radiation. It takes you, first of all, it's extraordinarily dangerous to be on an EVA for many reasons. We just recently, I think it was maybe a month or 2 ago, we saw that a spacesuit outside the ISS started filling with water. There's all sorts of malfunctions that can occur. And if you can use humanoid or other systems as in telepresence with real high fidelity, very low latency, you can do most of your missions as a robot. And I think more and more we're going to see a lot of the lunar missions being done, a lot of the work being done on the surface of the moon by telepresence robots. And again, not just in humanoid form. Right nearby me in Pasadena, there's a robotics company called Off-World, and they are doing just that. They're designing robotic units that can do mining, and they do what's called shepherding, where you would demonstrate what you want done, and you demonstrate with a VR headset. You don't do a lot of coding. You move around, and then the other robots will start to learn from what you're doing and mimic your behavior. But this is the type of thing you can really vastly accelerate. Think how many times people would have to suit up, go out for 8 hours, and it is exhausting wearing spacesuits. This is what you find out. You're essentially wearing a big leathery balloon. And in order to just pull your arms together takes a great deal of strength, and also to fold your hands. This is why the spacesuits are only inflated to about 1/3 or half pressure. Because if you inflated it to a full atmosphere, you wouldn't be able to move. You'd be a balloon. You'd be the Michelin Man. And so that's why they put pure oxygen in it, so that they can keep the pressure low. But as a result, before you put it on, you have to pre-breathe for 2 hours to get all the nitrogen out of your blood. There's a million other things that can go wrong. And so using telepresence systems, like an Atlas type, Boston Dynamics robot, or robots on the surface of the moon, you could have a warm seat rotation with people working shift after shift after shift, getting things done really fast in space. And somebody has to design the interfaces for it, the hardware for it, and so on. And I could also go into AR. I've had a lot of conversations with NASA people about that. All those buttons and switches. Now, you do see a modification in the Dragon capsule. You notice they have those tablets. I don't even think the tablets are going to be there for very long. I think there's going to be too heavy. You're going to be bringing hundreds of kilograms of switches and fuses and buttons and wires and chips, any one of which can go wrong. And if you can virtualize a lot of that and have dozens of these tiny little headsets that are cheap, you could even beam updates to the interface. The user could customize them. There's a whole bunch of advantage by virtualizing these interfaces.
So how big an addressable market do you think the private space industry is for AR, VR? And what's the timeline?
I always love this because I want you to put a number in your head of what you think the private space industry is annually in terms of revenue every year, and then I'm going to tell you. It's $450 billion a year right now. And right now, it's, I believe, PricewaterhouseCoopers projects that it's going to go up to about $1.4 trillion in the next 10 years. And it will accelerate from there. And again, remember, the goal here is you're going to be harnessing from near-Earth asteroids and from the moon, and also from the sun, energy and resources. These things have intrinsic value. And by bringing them into the control of our economy, bringing them into the purview of our economy, we can start to generate more and more activity. And again, that all redounds to the benefit of people on Earth. In particular, bringing energy to focus on Earth through solar power satellites and things like that. I always like to tell people that if you ringed the geosynchronous orbit of Earth, spaced fairly evenly and quite safely with solar power satellites, you could get up to 300 terawatts of energy beamed down to Earth. And if that's 20 times what the entire Earth uses right now. And that's completely clean, renewable energy. So very promising. So that's why I'm kind of excited about it and why I wanted to come here and talk about it.
Very hopeful for
Yeah,
all
it
of us.
is. And it's also not BS. That's the other great part about it.
And you've actually answered this a lot, but I'll ask it just in case we've missed anything.
Sorry, I raced ahead.
No. It's in what way would this market differ from the hype around the metaverse, and what would drive adoption of AR tech in this new space industry?
I suppose this is also another sweet spot about it because, again, there's probably a lot of creators and creatives in this room, and I tell stories myself, and I do love it. I did work in software development as a consultant and a developer for many years, and I remember that if you could either save the client money or make the client money, that was a good use for software. And this in particular, space applications are exactly that. Because remember, if you were to send a manned mission, a crewed mission, I should say is the term now, a crewed mission to space, the cost goes up drastically, and so does the risk. And therefore, it most likely will not occur. Now, if you can send a half dozen robots that are folded up origami style in a fairing, can land and don't need to decompress, they don't need to eat, you can give them energy, and you have let's say a crewed base in lunar orbit, where people could have low latency connections to those machines, you could start to do a whole series of missions that would, again, save money on launching the mission, greatly accelerate the project, and make a lot of money for people at the same time, bringing energy and resources back into the fold of all of humanity. So it is doing well while doing good, as they say.
Yeah, and I think that's what I find so inspiring about your work.
Yeah, it would not pollute the Earth.
Yeah.
And again, there will be lots of discussions about the moon's environment and so on. And that, I think, is a discussion that we all need to have. But once you get a good appreciation for just how huge the moon is, we're talking it would take us centuries to really start to make a difference. We don't want to change its appearance. I don't think we want lights on the moon. But I'd love us to be having these discussions because it's quite remarkable, but we are living right now at a time when it is technologically possible for us to do all of that. And the only catalyst that is missing is, again, the cost factor and the risk factor. And I think telepresence systems and augmented reality can help make that happen in a cost-effective manner. So again, if you wanted to work in space, you may be in the perfect business for that. There are dozens and dozens of space startups, private space startups. And if your company isn't thinking, perhaps, how you might be able to partner with some of those and do some really interesting work, I would highly recommend that you do.
Yeah. And there are space technology companies here at this event. I've met them.
Yeah, and I live in Pasadena, Caltech, and near JPL, all that stuff. You swing a stick, and you'll find some space startup.
It's exciting. So, AR and VR and AI technologies are very important for humanity to explore this great opportunity. The great commons of the earth and the oceans, unfortunately, are rather a sad example of the tragedy of the commons.
Sure.
But space is an opportunity for us to get this right.
It is.
But how do we get it right? And what is the governance? What are the incentives that might foster a beneficial space future for us all?
I love that question because we do have some lessons of the tragedy of the commons, but also of the cooperation that has happened. So we have some good lessons and some bad lessons. So for example, maritime law, and also there's some interesting things, the rules that govern Antarctica, which are only now starting to begin to fray. But for 50 years now, I think it's because the treaty that governs Antarctica is up, if not this year, I think next, or very soon. So for half a century, Antarctica has been cooperatively accessed. Everybody's been given equal access for scientific stations. Nobody's been allowed to mine it or do commercial activities. And there's also laws, international frameworks, let's call them, about I think it's called the ocean column, the depth of the ocean and what you can do in the deep ocean and what you can't do. Frequencies, radio frequencies and spectrum. There's a lot of successful things that make the devices that we use work, and it's proof that we can cooperate with one another across borders, across cultures, particularly when there's something to be gained versus something to be lost.
That's huge.
And the thing that I would add is there's a great deal to be gained by everyone in space. And I think that's the key, is to make it accessible to everyone. And the Outer Space Treaty, I think of 1969, was the beginnings of that. The Artemis Accords are the beginning of that, is to try to create a clear framework to hold up a rule of law and transparency. There will be tons of arguments over who can do what and where, but that drag them all out into the light and have them in full view. And the other thing I would point out is we're not going so far out into space that you won't be able to see what people are up to. It is going to be very transparent. You can see a great deal from about what is going on in space. So as opposed to underwater or mining or things, this is going to be in full view of all of humanity. And again, there's so much that can be done to help all of us. So I think both the benefits and the visibility of it is going to help. Now, that doesn't mean it's all going to be rosy. I always like to bring up the fact that every new technology takes about 30 years for us to ingest correctly. So aviation might be a good example. When aviation first began, airplanes, well, people just assumed if you bought property, you owned the land and everything above it. And then what happened was airplanes started flying over people's land very low and loud and smelly, and it irritated a lot of people, and people started saying, I think you're trespassing. And railroads in particular, when airplanes started flying airmail and became competitors, railroads suddenly discovered that you can't fly over my railroad. And this actually started a series of lawsuits that eventually, a couple decades later, led to the establishment of the FAA. And that is, I think, ultimately good, because not many of us would want to get on a plane that hasn't been approved by the FAA. So it involves a lot of litigation, a lot of arguing. But again, this forward momentum, this progress, technological, social, and otherwise, and space is going to be much bigger. And again, the benefits are going to be much bigger if we do it right.
Yeah, and I mean, it is really a chance to get it right, because abundance is much easier to govern in a situation of abundance. And you're right, the transparency, I mean, I started really looking up at space as a daily habit, just to remember this.
Well, that makes me happy, because I love it when readers get in touch with me and say, I actually believe this now.
Yeah.
And to me, it's because I wanted to take that step by step. And I've had that with my books before. I remember from my first book, Daemon, which was a cyber thriller, there was an NSA researcher who got in touch with me, and he said, I thought your book was ludicrous. And then I started saying, well, okay, that's possible, and that's possible, and that's possible. And they started stepping through it all, and they realized it was all possible. And it sort of woke them up to the possibilities. Yeah. Well, rather than a cautionary tale, this is an inspiring one.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, one sort of something you really do expand on in Critical Mass is Why is blockchain and trustless exchange so important for the development of space exploration?
Okay. So in these books, they do use a blockchain system, and in particular, that goes into the transparency we were talking about. You want a blockchain system so that everyone can see the transactions. The other thing is we are heading, like it or not, into a quasi-Cold War 2.0 scenario. Now, as we move into space and you see competing ideologies, how best do we preserve, first of all, the access for people, but also transparency? And blockchain is really made for this. The other interesting thing about it is energy. If you want to run a blockchain system and a cryptocurrency, and not necessarily proof of work, you could use proof of stake for those who are familiar with that. There's tons of energy in space. And I'll throw some stats at you, and you just cry uncle when you've had enough. So for solar energy in cislunar space, here on Earth, if you put a solar panel on the equator at noon on a clear day, that's about 1,000 watts per meter. And up in space, let's say in geosynchronous orbit, it's 1,348 watts per meter, but it's never sunset up there. There's never cloudy sky. And so it's constant. And like I said, that level of energy generation from a solar panel on Earth is right at the equator. As you go up the latitudes, it drops off precipitously. So there is a carbon impact from building solar panels here on Earth. Now, we need to do all that. We still need to have wind and turbine here to deal with climate change. But we can vastly accelerate it up in space by not burdening our biosphere, by building, all of it here. We can build a lot of it in space, and it can have an outsized impact to help pull some of the CO2 out.
Hugely important for our space, because at the moment, just drawing on what kind of energy we have available on Earth, like 1% of the population is using the same amount of energy as like 3.5 billion people living in poverty. It's just a very imbalanced. It's very imbalanced.
And by the way, I'm not going to wax too maudlin here, but there's about 4 billion people on Earth right now who exist at a subsistence level. It's about little less than half of the world existing on about $7 a day, about 25% at $3 a day. And just think being able to inject this, to basically grow the economy drastically. Because in case anybody's curious, the amount of sunlight, of all the sunlight that is created, that actually impacts the Earth, and I got to get this right, it's, let me see, 0.00000.5%. It's a tiny amount. So if we were to fill cislunar space, not fill it, but to place large solar power receiving stations, we could benefit from all that clean energy very well. And to bring it back to augmented reality and VR, that helps us do it in a way that's not going to get a whole bunch of people harmed and killed. If you can set up a crewed station near there, let's say near the moon, near to where you want to build these things and where the resources are, you could have groups of people sitting in comfort and safety, shielded from radiation and other dangers, operating robots on the surface of the moon or asteroids and so on, and conducting all of these things in a warm seat rotation. And it could be very interesting designing the equipment, the interfaces, and so on for that.
One last question, I think I asked this for many of us here, is there's really, this is a large gathering of, some of the most important AR, VR developers in the world, and some of the most interesting startups, and come here. If you have a startup or you haven't, an AR, VR company, and you haven't really thought about space yet, what sort of conferences might you attend?
I have a conference for you. The National Space Society. It's held every year. It's a great way to dip your foot in. It's the big vision about where we need to go. And they've been around since, Gerard K. O'Neill wrote The High Frontier in 1976. So they have a really good mission. By the way, I'm not paid by them. I'm just very much a fan of their work. And again, joining up with the experts in aerospace, astronautical engineering, I think there's a tremendous overlap. If I were to draw a Venn diagram, I think in the near future, you folks will be working together with space people. Love entertainment, and by the way, there will be entertainment needed in space as well. But, if we start to push out, it'd be fascinating work, challenging work, but also could do tremendous benefit to all of civilization.
Well, we're coming. We've got 20 seconds left, so I would just.
I'll hurry.
I mean, really, I would just like to say a big thank you really on behalf of all of us, because
It was my pleasure.
it's a huge inspiration. It's, reading your books has been part of my life. Daniel came to one of our early AWE events, and this event really was, when Ori and I got together, the premise was we would take design fiction to design fact, but we couldn't have done any of it without the greatness of some of the great design fiction novelists like Daniel Suarez. So I just thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.